"I haven't slept next to a woman since the war," the rancher confessed to the captive Apache woman. John Mercer rode slowly along the dusty trail that led to his ranch, the sun hanging low over the horizon. The air smelled dry and sharp, carrying the faint scent of wild sage and distant pine. He tightened his grip on the reins of his horse, a dark, sturdy stallion named Thunder, feeling the familiar ache in his muscles that came from years of hard labor. The land stretched for miles around him, empty except for the occasional twisted tree or jagged rock. It was beautiful in its harsh way, but lonely too. The war had ended years ago, yet it still haunted him. Some nights he could still hear the echo of gunfire in his mind, the screams of men he had known, friends who were gone forever. He remembered the way the earth had trembled beneath the charge of cavalry, the smell of smoke and blood, and the endless nights when he had lain in the mud, shivering, wondering if he would ever see the sun again. Those memories were not kind. They clung to him like a shadow, impossible to shake. At the ranch, the buildings stood silent, their wooden walls weathered and worn by time and wind. John's cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a wide porch where he often sat at the end of a long day, staring at the horizon. The ranch itself had once been bustling with workers and neighbors, but now it was mostly empty. He had chosen solitude long before the war, but the years of fighting had made it even more pronounced. People came and went in the world beyond, but John stayed, keeping to the rhythm of the land, the animals, and the seasons. As he dismounted and led Thunder toward the stable, he noticed a movement at the edge of the property. At first, he thought it was a deer or perhaps a coyote, but then he saw her. She was crouched near the fence, her dark hair falling across her face. Her eyes, wide and wary, met his, and in that instant John felt a strange twist of curiosity and caution. The young woman was Apache. He could tell from the features and the way she held herself, tense and alert, ready to flee at any moment. John's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder, but he did not raise it. Instead, he studied her silently, noting the fear and defiance in her gaze. She looked as if she had been running for days, her clothes torn and her body tired. There was no denying that she was in trouble, but John also knew that anyone could be dangerous when desperate. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. He did not move closer, giving her space, though the tension in the air was thick. The woman said nothing at first. She only watched him, her eyes sharp and calculating. Then, in careful English, broken and deliberate, she replied, "I mean no harm, please." John studied her for a long moment. He had seen many people in his life, from neighbors to soldiers, but never someone like her in such circumstances. The war had taken many things from him, but it had also taught him caution. He could not simply let her wander or leave her to the dangers beyond the ranch, but he also could not trust her entirely. Slowly, he stepped forward, keeping his hands visible. "You can stay near the fence," he said. "I'll fetch you water and food, but you stay there." She nodded slightly, relief flickering in her eyes. John went to the cabin and returned with a bowl of water and a piece of bread. He set it down at a safe distance. She hesitated, then took it, eating quickly as if every bite might be her last. As she ate, John noticed the way she moved, careful, precise, aware of every sound and shadow. She was strong, yet fragile, carrying a weight he could sense even without knowing her story. He wanted to ask questions, to know how she had ended up here, but he knew that trust was not given lightly. It had to be earned. Days passed, and John observed her from a distance. He worked the ranch as he always did, tending the animals, mending fences, and checking the fields. The woman, whose name he learned was Ahioka, watched quietly from the edge of the property, sometimes helping in small ways, gathering firewood or drawing water from the well. They did not speak much, but a silent understanding began to grow between them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, John sat on the porch, smoking a pipe. Ahioka approached cautiously, holding a small bundle of herbs she had gathered. She placed it near him and nodded, a small gesture of trust. "I haven't slept next to a woman since the war," John confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared at the horizon, seeing not just the landscape, but the memories that lingered there, friends lost, battles fought, and the loneliness that had become his companion. Ahioka did not speak. She only listened, understanding that some wounds were invisible and deep. She had her own burdens, her own fears, yet in that moment, the distance between them seemed smaller. Words were not needed. The presence of another human being who could share the silence was enough. As the night deepened, John felt an unfamiliar sensation, a flicker of connection, fragile but undeniable. He had survived the war, yes, but surviving did not mean living fully. And perhaps in this quiet, tense, and cautious relationship with Ahioka, there was a chance for something more. A chance to remember what it felt like to trust, to care, and to allow oneself to be vulnerable again. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the sounds of the desert night. Owls called from the distance, and the horses in the stable shifted in their stalls. John and Ahioka sat near the fire, the flames dancing across their faces, each lost in their own thoughts. He thought about the past, about the war and its endless nights, and how it had shaped him into the man he was now, hard, cautious, and solitary. Yet, as he glanced at Ahioka, he realized that even the most hardened hearts could find a spark of warmth if only they allowed it. The first part of their story was not about romance or grand gestures. It was about trust, survival, and the quiet steps two people took toward understanding each other. Every glance, every small act, every moment of shared silence brought them closer. In a world marked by hardship, violence, and loss, these small connections were precious, fragile, and powerful. John knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and dangers. But for the first time in many years, he felt a sense of possibility. He could not undo the past, and the memories of war would always remain, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to live in the present. And in the quiet companionship of Ahioka, he began to feel that living again might be possible. The night grew colder, and the stars shone brightly above the vast, empty land. John Mercer looked at Ahioka, sitting silently near the fire, and felt a mixture of caution, hope, and something else he had almost forgotten, the fragile, tender ache of human connection. It was a small beginning, but beginnings, after all, were where all great stories started. The days that followed were quiet but tense. John and Ahioka moved around each other with a careful rhythm, like two animals testing the boundaries of trust. Each knew that mistakes could be dangerous, and yet slowly they began to establish a fragile routine. The mornings were filled with the familiar sounds of the ranch, cows lowing in the pens, horses shifting in their stalls, the creak of wooden gates opening and closing. John worked tirelessly, repairing fences, mending tools, and making sure the animals were fed. Ahioka shadowed him at a cautious distance, sometimes helping without a word, her movements precise and careful. She was quiet but observant. Every glance, every small motion told her something about him. She saw the careful way he handled the animals, the respect he showed them, and the quiet discipline in his work. He did not speak much about himself, not yet, but his presence, steady and unwavering, spoke volumes. She had been on her own for a long time, hiding from danger, moving from place to place. The silence was not awkward. It was a kind of understanding. Both of them were survivors, and both of them knew what it was to be alone. John noticed her too, though he tried not to. There was something in the way she moved, alert but graceful, that reminded him of a hawk in the desert sky, watchful, powerful, yet always aware of the dangers surrounding it. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and cautious, never fully trusting, yet always observing. He found himself wondering about her story, about the life she had lived before she came to his ranch. But he kept his distance, knowing that trust was fragile and easily broken. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink, John called out to her. "Ahioka," he said, using the name she had finally shared with him. "Come help me with the fence." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. Helping him meant crossing a line she had drawn for herself, a line between survival and dependency. But after a moment, she nodded and walked toward him, her steps careful, her gaze never leaving his face. The work was slow and deliberate. John handed her nails and tools, showing her how to use them when needed, while she watched him, learning quickly. There was a quiet bond forming in the shared labor, a kind of trust that did not need words. She did not speak much, and he did not ask questions. The world beyond the ranch was dangerous, filled with people who would exploit weakness. Here, among the fences and the animals, they could begin to exist in a small, cautious peace. At midday, they paused for water and a simple meal. Ahioka had gathered herbs earlier, and she prepared a small bundle of greens that John reluctantly tasted. He had never been one for delicacies, but there was something comforting in her careful, patient way of preparing food. She watched him eat, her eyes assessing, as if trying to read his thoughts. John noticed the care she took in every action, the subtle movements that betrayed her sharp mind and steady hands. "You cook well," he said, finally breaking the silence. She tilted her head, uncertain. "I must learn," she replied slowly. Her English was careful, deliberate, each word chosen with attention. "I must survive." John nodded, understanding without needing to say more. Survival was a lesson they both knew intimately. He did not ask about her family or her life before the capture. Such questions were dangerous, both for the past they carried and the future they might build. Instead, he focused on the present, the work, the land, and the cautious companionship between them. Over the following days, small gestures became a language of their own. John would leave tools where she could reach them, and she would gather water or firewood before he asked. Sometimes they would share brief glances that spoke of understanding, of recognition, of the shared knowledge that the world beyond the ranch was not safe. Words were scarce, but actions were plenty. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, John found her sitting near the barn, weaving a small basket from reeds. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "That is good work," he said, nodding at the basket. Ahioka looked up briefly, then returned to her weaving. "It is useful," she said. "I make things to help survive." John watched her fingers move with precision, weaving the strands into a strong, functional shape. There was something mesmerizing in the concentration, something peaceful amid the constant tension of survival. He realized that these quiet moments, these small, deliberate actions, were as important as any grand gesture. They were learning to trust each other in the smallest, most human ways. That night, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of the desert and the soft rustle of leaves. John sat on the porch, smoking his pipe, while Ahioka tended a small fire near the edge of the ranch. She had kept her distance as always, yet he felt her presence keenly. "I haven't slept next to a woman since the war," he said again, this time without looking at her. The words were heavy, carrying the weight of years of solitude, fear, and loss. Ahioka did not respond immediately. She only watched the flames, her face illuminated by their glow. Slowly she approached, sitting a few feet away. They did not speak, but the space between them seemed less empty, filled instead with a quiet acknowledgement of shared experience. Trust, they were learning, did not arrive all at once. It grew slowly in moments like this, fragile but real. In the following days, their bond continued to grow, built on careful observation and quiet understanding. John taught her to ride one of the younger horses, guiding her hand and showing her how to maintain balance. She learned quickly, her confidence growing with each passing day. And though neither spoke of it, there was a sense of relief in the shared labor, a feeling that perhaps they could survive together, even in this harsh and lonely land. Yet the past, as always, lingered. John could not forget the war, the friends he had lost, the nights spent in mud and fear. And Ahioka carried her own memories of a life interrupted, of family and people she might never see again. These silent burdens shaped their interactions, making each gesture, each glance significant. They were survivors not by choice but by necessity. And in the quiet moments between work and rest, they began to see in each other something familiar: resilience, strength, and the flicker of hope that perhaps life could be more than endless survival. One afternoon, while tending the horses, a sudden noise startled them. A coyote, curious and cautious, had approached the edge of the ranch. John raised his hand, signaling Ahioka to stay calm. Together, they watched the animal move away, a small but meaningful moment of cooperation. The world outside could be harsh, unpredictable, and dangerous, but together they were learning to navigate it. That evening, as they sat by the fire once more, John found himself speaking again. "You are stronger than I thought," he said quietly. Ahioka met his gaze briefly, then looked down at the flames. "I must be," she replied. "The world does not forgive weakness." John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had lived by similar rules, had learned them in blood and fire, and recognized the truth in them. Yet in her presence, there was also a reminder that strength did not have to be solitary. There was room, however small, for trust, for connection, and for quiet companionship. The days passed, and slowly, the ranch felt less lonely. John and Ahioka still spoke little, but their interactions were full of meaning. A glance, a gesture, a shared task. They were learning to rely on each other, to understand each other without the need for words. And in that quiet understanding, something fragile and new began to take root. The sense that perhaps, even in a world marked by danger and loss, human connection could be reclaimed, one careful step at a time. As the sun set each evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, John would watch Ahioka moving about the ranch, her movements confident yet careful. He saw the resilience in her eyes, the intelligence in her actions, and a growing awareness that they were no longer merely two survivors coexisting. They were becoming allies, companions in the harsh but beautiful world they both called home. The truce between them was uneasy yet real. It was not born of friendship or love or even full trust, but of necessity, respect, and a quiet understanding. And in this uneasy truce, John began to see the possibility of something more. A slow, careful building of connection that could withstand the weight of past traumas and the dangers that still lurked in the world beyond the ranch. The ranch had settled into a quiet rhythm, but the calm was fragile, like the thin ice that forms over a river in early winter. John and Ahioka had begun to understand each other without speaking much. Small gestures and shared labor had created a silent bond, but both of them knew the peace could not last forever. Life in the West was harsh, and danger often arrived without warning. One afternoon, John was repairing a broken fence along the northern edge of the property when he noticed movement in the distance. At first, it seemed like a mirage, a trick of the heat on the dusty horizon. But as he squinted, his experienced eyes picked up the faint shapes of riders moving swiftly across the plains. They were armed, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. John's heart tightened. Bandits or hostile settlers, either could spell trouble. He returned to the cabin and found Ahioka near the well, gathering water. "Riders," he said quietly, pointing toward the horizon. "We may have trouble." Her eyes widened slightly, but she did not panic. Instead, she moved closer to him, her posture alert and ready. There was an unspoken understanding. They would face this together. In that moment, John realized that the trust between them, fragile as it was, might be the only thing standing between them and disaster. The riders came closer, and John saw the glint of weapons in the sunlight. He quickly assessed the situation. The attackers seemed organized, not random marauders. They might be after land, livestock, or valuables. Either way, John knew he could not simply wait for them to reach the ranch. Preparation was necessary. He turned to Ahioka. "Help me with the barricades," he said. "We'll need the barn doors secured and the gates reinforced. Stay close and do exactly as I say." Ahioka nodded, moving quickly and efficiently. She lifted heavy planks with ease, tying ropes and securing gates under John's direction. It was clear she had experience with survival and quick thinking, skills born from necessity and danger. John admired her strength and intelligence, though he said nothing. Words were not needed. Their shared work spoke volumes. As they prepared the ranch, John's mind drifted to memories of the war, the chaos, the fear, and the decisions he had been forced to make. He had fought to protect others then, and now he was fighting to protect this fragile peace, this small sanctuary he had built. The parallels were striking, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. By evening, the riders had come close enough for John to see their faces. They were rough, hardened men, with eyes that betrayed a mix of greed and cruelty. The tension in the air was thick, as if the very land itself held its breath. John and Ahioka waited silently, each ready for whatever might come. The first confrontation was sudden. A rider dismounted near the edge of the ranch, shouting demands. John stepped forward, his rifle at the ready, his voice calm but firm. "This is private property. Leave now or face consequences." The man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "We don't care about property. We want the livestock and anything valuable. Step aside, old man." John's jaw tightened. He had no intention of surrendering his home or letting harm come to Ahioka. He signaled her to stay close, moving strategically to protect both the cabin and the animals. Ahioka understood without question, her presence calm but alert. She had learned to read his movements and anticipate his actions, and in that moment, their unspoken communication became a powerful advantage. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, though in reality it was only minutes. Tension crackled in the air, and every sound, the clatter of hooves, the creak of wood, the whisper of the wind, felt amplified. Then, without warning, the attackers tried to force their way past the gate. John fired a warning shot, and the sound echoed across the plains. The riders hesitated, momentarily unsure, giving John and Ahioka precious time to regroup. Ahioka moved with precision, helping to secure doors and barricades, her eyes sharp and calculating. John could not help but notice how fearless she was, even in the face of real danger. Her presence steadied him, reminding him that he was not alone, that even after years of solitude and pain, human connection could provide strength. As night fell, the tension did not ease. The attackers had not given up. They were camped nearby, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. John and Ahioka sat by a small fire in the barn, catching their breath and sharing a quiet moment. The bond between them had deepened, forged not just in shared labor but in shared survival. "I've faced men like them before," John said quietly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "But it's different when someone you care about is at risk." Ahioka did not respond immediately. She only nodded, her gaze steady. In her silence, there was understanding. Words were unnecessary. They had proven themselves capable of relying on each other in ways that transcended language. The following days were filled with vigilance. John and Ahioka worked together tirelessly, reinforcing the ranch and preparing for any further attacks. They took turns keeping watch, sleeping in shifts, always aware that the threat could return at any moment. Despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of purpose in their efforts, a clarity that came from knowing exactly what they were protecting. In the quiet moments between preparation and defense, John found himself opening up more than he had in years. He told Ahioka about the war, not in the graphic details but in the emotions, the losses, and the lessons he had learned. She listened attentively, never interrupting, never judging, only absorbing the story and offering quiet support through her presence. Ahioka shared fragments of her own past as well. She spoke of her family, the times before the capture, and the struggles she had faced to survive. Her voice was steady, but the emotions behind it were clear. John realized that despite their differences, their experiences had shaped them in similar ways, resilient, cautious, and aware of the fragility of life. One evening, as the stars filled the sky, John and Ahioka sat together near the fire outside the cabin. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and sage. John looked at her, noticing the determination in her eyes, the quiet strength that had become a constant presence in his life. "I trust you," he said quietly, "more than I've trusted anyone in a long time." Ahioka met his gaze, a flicker of emotion passing through her eyes. "I trust you too," she replied. It was not a declaration of friendship or love, but a recognition of the bond that had grown between them, born of survival, shared effort, and mutual respect. The next day brought more challenges. Scouts from the attackers were spotted at the edge of the property, testing defenses and searching for weaknesses. John and Ahioka worked tirelessly to anticipate their moves, setting traps and planning contingencies. Every action required precision, trust, and cooperation. Their bond, already strong, was tested and strengthened in equal measure. By nightfall, the scouts had retreated, but the threat remained. John and Ahioka sat in silence, sharing a meal and a quiet understanding. The danger was not over, and the world beyond the ranch was still unpredictable, but they had faced the first challenge together and emerged stronger. In these moments of shared struggle, John began to understand the value of human connection once more. The war had taught him survival, but it had also taught him isolation. With Ahioka, he was learning that strength could be found in partnership, that courage was amplified when shared, and that trust, even fragile and cautious, was worth the risk. The bond between them was growing, subtle but undeniable. It was not built on words alone, nor on grand gestures, but on shared effort, quiet understanding, and the mutual recognition of strength and resilience. In the harsh landscape of the West, amid the lingering shadows of war and the ever-present threat of danger, John and Ahioka were discovering that human connection could survive, and even thrive, when built on respect, trust, and shared experience. As the night deepened, John watched the stars above, reflecting on the past, the present, and the uncertain future. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but few had tested him as deeply as this one. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope, not for the world beyond the ranch, but for the small, fragile world he was building here, alongside Ahioka. The morning sun rose pale and weak over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch. John Mercer was already awake, moving quietly through the yard, checking the fences and ensuring the animals were secure. The night had been restless, full of fleeting sounds and the subtle warning signals that had become second nature to him. Even in sleep, his mind could not escape the shadow of danger. Ahioka appeared at the edge of the barn, carrying water in a wooden bucket. She moved with her usual caution, alert to every sound, every movement. Her presence had become a comfort, yet also a reminder of the responsibility he now bore. Protecting her was no longer a matter of courtesy, it was a necessity, and he felt the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. As they worked together, a sudden shout broke the morning calm. John turned sharply, heart racing. The attackers had returned, larger in number and more organized than before. They had not been idle during the night. Their horses galloped across the plains, dust rising in thick clouds, and the sound of hooves and voices carried across the ranch. John signaled to Ahioka, and they moved quickly to the barn, barricading the doors and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. There was no time for hesitation. John's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the rifles, loading them carefully, while Ahioka assisted without question. She had observed his movements for days, learned his habits, and now she moved as an extension of his instincts. Together they were a team, a unit formed out of necessity and survival, yet strengthened by trust and mutual respect. The first wave of attackers reached the fence line. John fired a warning shot, and the sound echoed across the plains, momentarily halting their advance. Ahioka crouched behind a stack of hay, her eyes scanning for weaknesses in their approach. She had learned quickly, and John recognized that she was no ordinary ally. Her intelligence, courage, and quick thinking had become indispensable. The attackers pressed on, shouting and waving their weapons. John and Ahioka responded in unison, moving strategically to defend the property. Each action was calculated, a combination of instinct and experience. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air, but amidst the chaos, there was a strange clarity. This was not just a fight for property. It was a test of their bond, their trust, and their ability to face danger together. During the battle, a rider managed to break through a section of the fence, heading straight for the barn. John fired, wounding the man, but another attacker followed close behind. Ahioka, quick and decisive, grabbed a heavy tool and blocked the intruder's path, forcing him to retreat. John watched her in amazement. Her courage, her decisiveness under pressure, revealed a strength that matched his own. For a moment he felt a surge of pride, not for himself but for her, for the bond they had formed through trust and mutual reliance. The fight continued for hours, though the time seemed to stretch endlessly. Dust, sweat, and adrenaline filled the air. John's mind flashed to memories of the war, the fear, the chaos, the necessity of split-second decisions. Yet now there was a difference. He was not alone. Ahioka was by his side not as a follower but as an equal. They were survivors together, facing a threat that demanded everything they had learned about courage, patience, and strategy. At one point, John was forced to retreat into the cabin, and Ahioka followed without hesitation. They secured the doors and waited, listening to the sounds outside. The attackers were regrouping, planning their next move. John looked at her, noticing the way her eyes had grown sharp and determined. She was no longer just a captive. She was a partner, a presence that had become essential to his survival. The tension was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind through the trees was magnified. John felt the old fear return, the same fear that had haunted him through the war, but it was tempered now by a new force, connection. He was not facing this alone. Ahioka's courage and presence steadied him, reminding him that trust, once built, could be a shield stronger than any fence or rifle. Then came the critical moment. A group of attackers attempted to break through a side entrance, and John was struck in the shoulder. Pain shot through him, sharp and blinding, but he refused to fall. Ahioka reacted immediately, positioning herself between him and the intruders, forcing them back with quick, decisive movements. She dragged him to cover, supporting his weight, and for the first time, John realized how deeply he relied on her, not just for survival but for strength, for courage, for the shared resilience that had grown between them. The attackers were persistent, but John and Ahioka held their ground. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher and then descending again, until finally the bandits retreated, their numbers diminished and their morale broken. The ranch was battered but intact, and the quiet that followed was almost surreal. John sank to the floor, exhaustion overtaking him, while Ahioka knelt beside him, tending to his wound with a careful, steady hand. In that moment, something shifted between them. The fear, tension, and adrenaline had forged a connection deeper than either had anticipated. John looked at Ahioka, really looked, and saw not just a companion, but a person who had become indispensable, whose presence had changed the rhythm of his life. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw understanding, empathy, and a recognition that they had survived not just through skill, but through trust in each other. "Thank you," John whispered, his voice hoarse from exertion and pain. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ahioka shook her head slightly. "We survived together," she said softly, "not alone together." They sat in silence, the fire from the cabin hearth flickering between them. Words were no longer necessary. The shared experience of danger, the fear, and the triumph had created a bond that could not easily be broken. They had faced death together and emerged stronger, connected in a way that transcended words. As night fell, the stars appearing in the dark sky, John and Ahioka moved carefully around the ranch, checking for damage and ensuring that the animals were safe. The physical wounds were minor, but the emotional impact was profound. Each had seen the courage and resilience of the other, and in that recognition, a new understanding had been born, a sense of partnership, respect, and perhaps the beginnings of trust that could lead to something more. After the work was done, they returned to the cabin, sitting by the fire once more. John removed his jacket, revealing the wound on his shoulder. Ahioka's hands were steady as she cleaned it and bandaged it carefully. The gesture was intimate, not in a romantic sense, but in a profound human way. They cared for each other because they had to, because they trusted each other, and because they had come to see that survival was not just about skill or strength. It was about connection, empathy, and the willingness to be vulnerable with someone else. "I haven't felt this alive in years," John admitted quietly, his voice carrying both exhaustion and wonder. "The war, it took so much from me. I thought I would never feel anything like this again." Ahioka looked at him, her expression calm but intense. "Life is fragile. But we endure. We find strength even in others." They stayed there for a long time, listening to the quiet of the night, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The ranch had survived the attack, but more importantly, they had survived together. And in that survival, they had discovered something invaluable: the power of trust, connection, and shared courage. The events of the day had changed them both. John no longer saw Ahioka simply as a captive. She was a partner, a companion, and a reminder that even in a harsh and dangerous world, human connection could bring strength and hope. Ahioka, too, saw John in a new light, not merely as a protector, but as someone who could be trusted, someone who had faced fear and hardship with her, and someone whose presence could be a source of stability and safety. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, John and Ahioka sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, but connected by the unspoken bond forged in the crucible of danger. They had faced the worst of what the world could throw at them and had emerged not just alive, but stronger, united, and aware that the future, whatever it might hold, would be faced together. The morning after the attack was quiet, almost peaceful. The sun rose over the ranch, casting a soft golden light across the fields and fences. Birds sang tentatively, as if testing the air for safety, and the horses in the stable stirred lazily. John Mercer moved slowly, his shoulder still aching from the wound, but there was a sense of calm that had been absent for years. For the first time in a long while, he felt the possibility of hope. Ahioka appeared near the barn, her movements deliberate but relaxed. She had spent the night tending the animals, checking fences, and making sure that the property was secure. There was a quiet pride in the way she moved, a sense that the danger had changed something in her, not fear, but determination, resilience, and understanding. John watched her from the porch, noticing how much she had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch, and more importantly, his life. The aftermath of the attack required work. Fences had been damaged, the barn gate bent, and a few animals were missing. John and Ahioka moved together efficiently, repairing, feeding, and checking every corner of the ranch. Each task was a small victory, a step toward restoring the balance that had been threatened. Their cooperation was seamless, built on trust and shared experience. Where one moved, the other followed, instinctively knowing what needed to be done. As they worked, John reflected on the events of the past days. The attacks had been terrifying, but they had also revealed something he had not felt in years: connection. He had survived the war, yes, but he had done so alone. Now, facing danger side by side with Ahioka, he realized that survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about trust, partnership, and shared courage. He had come to rely on her, not because he had to, but because her presence made him stronger, braver, and more aware of the possibilities in life. Ahioka, for her part, had also changed. She had arrived at the ranch wary, cautious, and ready to flee at any sign of danger. But the events of the past days had taught her that trust could exist, even in a world filled with betrayal and violence. She had seen John's courage, his dedication, and his willingness to face danger alongside her, and she had begun to understand that safety and even comfort could be found in someone else's presence. By midday, the work was done, at least for the moment. They sat together on the porch, sharing a simple meal of bread, dried meat, and water. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Neither needed to fill the space with words. Their companionship had already spoken volumes. John finally broke the silence. "We've been through a lot," he said quietly, watching the horizon. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to face it with you here. Not because I need to, but because I want to." Ahioka met his gaze, her dark eyes steady and calm. "I want that too," she said slowly. "We survive together. We can face what comes together." Her voice was quiet but firm, filled with the strength that had carried them through the attacks and the long days before. The bond between them was no longer fragile or tentative. It had been tested, proven, and strengthened through shared danger, labor, and trust. What had begun as an uneasy truce had grown into a partnership, built on respect, understanding, and the recognition of each other's courage. The days turned into weeks, and the ranch gradually returned to its quiet rhythm. John and Ahioka worked side by side, tending the animals, repairing fences, and cultivating the land. Each task reinforced their connection, reminding them that life, even after trauma, could offer moments of peace, accomplishment, and shared joy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John and Ahioka sat together near the fire outside the cabin. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and sage, and the sky was painted with shades of orange, pink, and purple. John looked at her, noticing the subtle changes in her expression, the quiet confidence, the ease in her movements, and the trust in her eyes. "I never thought I'd feel this, alive again," John said softly. "The war took so much from me, but now it feels like life is giving something back, and I want to live it fully, with you." Ahioka reached out, placing her hand gently on his. It was a simple gesture, but it carried profound meaning. "Life is fragile," she said. "But we endure, and we can find strength together." The connection between them deepened in that moment. It was not merely about survival or protection. It was about trust, respect, and the quiet joy of companionship. They had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty, and they had come through it together, stronger than they had been alone. As night fell, they moved inside the cabin, tending the small fire and preparing for rest. The animals were safe, the ranch secure, and for the first time in years, John felt a sense of peace. The memories of war and past hardships still lingered, but they no longer dominated his life. There was room now for hope, for healing, and for the possibility of happiness. Ahioka sat near him, and for a while they simply watched the flames, lost in their thoughts. The silence was not empty. It was filled with understanding, connection, and the unspoken promise that they would face the future together. They had learned that life could be harsh and unpredictable, but it could also offer moments of warmth, trust, and companionship that made the hardships bearable. Over the following days, their bond continued to grow. They shared stories of their pasts, not just the painful moments, but also the small joys and victories. John told Ahioka about the friends he had lost and the lessons he had learned during the war. She spoke of her family, her people, and the challenges she had faced before coming to the ranch. Each story strengthened their understanding of one another, building empathy, respect, and a deeper emotional connection. The community around the ranch, once wary of John's solitude, began to notice the changes. They saw him working alongside Ahioka, observing the partnership that had grown from necessity into mutual respect. Some offered help or advice, but most simply respected the quiet strength of their bond. John and Ahioka did not need external validation. The bond they had forged was enough. One morning, after a light snowfall had dusted the fields, John and Ahioka stood at the edge of the property, looking out over the land. The ranch had been damaged by the attacks, but it had survived, and so had they. John took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and turned to her. "We've been through so much," he said, "and yet here we are, stronger together." Ahioka smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both warmth and determination. "Yes, together," she agreed. "We face life together now." The sense of partnership, of trust, and of shared resilience was profound. They had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty, and they had emerged not just alive, but connected, stronger, and capable of building a life together. The hardships of the past, the memories of war, and the scars of survival were still there, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of what they had endured and the strength they had found in one another. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the ranch became a place of stability, peace, and quiet joy. John and Ahioka continued to work side by side, tending the land, caring for the animals, and building a life that was both simple and meaningful. The connection between them deepened, not just in moments of danger, but in the everyday acts of trust, cooperation, and shared responsibility. And in the quiet evenings, when the sun set and the stars appeared in the sky, they would sit together by the fire, reflecting on the journey they had taken. From the initial tension and caution, through the trials of danger and fear, to the growing bond of trust and partnership, their story had reached a place of balance, understanding, and hope. John Mercer, the man who had not slept next to a woman since the war, found in Ahioka not just a companion, but a source of strength, courage, and trust. And Ahioka, who had arrived wary and cautious, discovered that connection, partnership, and even the possibility of peace could exist, even in a harsh and uncertain world. Their journey was not over, for life on the frontier would always bring new challenges. But they had learned that together, they could face whatever came with resilience, trust, and shared courage. And in that understanding, they found a sense of fulfillment, hope, and a beginning that, though fragile, was strong enough to endure. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude and isolation, had become a home filled with quiet strength, partnership, and the shared determination to face life together. And as the fire burned low and the stars shone above, John and Ahioka sat side by side, knowing that the past had shaped them, the present had tested them, and the future, whatever it might hold, would be faced together, with courage, trust, and an unbreakable bond.